Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us for our October Art at Noon talk today. My name is Corey Fry. I'm the exhibitions manager at the Delaplaine Art Center. And I'm really excited about today's talk from Andrea Nelson. I wanted to let you know of a few things before we get started. Come and check out our exhibitions that we have on site. We've got 5 great shows up, and they will all be closing at the end of October. So you got just a little bit of time left to come check those out. We've got work from McKay Auto, our contemporary innovations artists. We've got a group show from a local gallery, the Noma Gallery, and then 3 solo exhibitions, all really good work worth checking out. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you come into the building, you can grab one of our magazines and check out all of the additional programming that we have coming up for the fall. And we'll be getting out some information on our winter programming as well. We've got lots of great classes starting up, other talks, and other great programs happening. So all really good stuff that you can check out. And you can find that info on our website or in the magazine here at the Delaplaine on site. So check those things out. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and let us know what those might be. I'm really excited about our talk today. Coming up in November, we have a focus on photography here at the Delaplaine. So all of our exhibitions will be photography exhibitions, including our National Juried Photography exhibition. And I'm really excited about our talk today because our speaker, Andrea Nelson, is a curator of photography at the National Gallery of Art. So as Andrea's talking, if you have any questions at all for her, you can submit those in the chat or using the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the end of her talk, we'll set aside some time for her to field some of your questions. But feel free at any time to submit those questions in either of those 2 places, and we'll get to them. So I'm going to introduce our speaker today, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. But Andrea Nelson is an associate curator in the Department of Photographs at the National Gallery of Art, where she's worked since 2010. She received her PhD from the University of Minnesota, focusing on 20th century art and the history of photography. Andrea came to the National Gallery of Art as a graduate curatorial intern in 2007, and later held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for the Study of Modern Art at the Phillips Collection. She's published essays on German and American photography books, as well as organized several exhibitions, including The New Woman Behind the Camera in 2021, The Memory of Time, Contemporary Photographs from the National Gallery of Art, acquired with the Alfred H. Moses and Fern M. Shad Fund in 2015, and A Subtle Beauty, Platinum Photographs from the collection in 2014. She also serves as a co-chair of the museum's time-based media art working group. In addition to her curatorial work, Andrea has taught courses on writing and the decorative arts, modern and contemporary art, and the history of photography. Andrea, thank you very much for being with us today. I'm really excited to hear from you, and I'm gonna just turn things over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Corey, and hello, everyone, and good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. So I'm going to share my screen, and I will talk a bit about my curatorial practice. And I think I'll do that through talking about, giving you an overview of the most recent project that I curated, and that was The New Woman Behind the Camera. So this was an exhibition that I organized for the National Gallery of Art, and it traveled then to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And, when I'm done kind of walking you through the show and I have some installation shots, I'll focus on a few of the critical issues that I faced in, with the organization of such a large project that was focused exclusively on women photographers. And I'll touch briefly about an earlier exhibition that I did that focused on more contemporary photographers. So just a very short background. Corey did a wonderful introduction. But I was always interested in photography, and I think it started when I was about 5 or 6 years old, when my father gave me a very, inexpensive, simple camera, and he said, go take photographs, and I could take photographs of whatever I wanted, and then we would go together to the drugstore and drop off the film, and then go back later and pick up pictures, and so it was always a fun hobby for me. And when I was in high school, I became very interested in journalism and photojournalism. But when I ended up going into college, I decided to study art history, but I took a lot of art classes, and I very much wanted to learn how to develop film and print pictures, and just to understand better, the art that I was, studying. And then I went on and focused more on art history in graduate school, and ended up focusing on the history of photography when I wrote my dissertation. And that's really what ended up bringing me to the gallery, because I was really interested in photography books, the kind of narratives that were being produced through photographs. And at that time, when I was finishing my graduate work, the National Gallery, Sarah Greeno was organizing her exhibition on Robert Frank's The Americans, of course, that very important photography book from the 60s. And I thought, this is such great timing. And I was so happy to see a major museum interested in photography books, because it seemed to me that, they were so important, right, to photographers, to the history of photography, but they really weren't discussed, I think, more broadly in the public sphere. And so I interned at the National Gallery. I kept in contact with the National Gallery and did contract work. And then in 2010, I was able to, I was hired then as a full-time curator. And really, I was tasked to work with the permanent collection and to think about exhibitions that would come out of the permanent collection. And that brings me really to the seeds of the new woman behind the camera, because I was very interested in the gallery's collection of photographs by Ilse Bing. We have about 90 works by Bing, and many were given to the gallery by her and her estate in the early 1990s. She's actually one of the few women that we have in-depth, holdings of. And, she really made an important contribution to the field of modern photography. Of course, she worked almost exclusively with the Leica camera, which we see here. She's holding that in her hands. And when I started researching her life, her career, and that, she was born in Frankfurt, Germany, worked in Germany, ended up going to Paris, like a number of artists did in the 20s and 30s, and escaped Nazism and came over to the United States. And when I was doing this research, I was thinking about a show just on her work. And I do hope that someday I'll be able to do that. But I started to look kind of more broadly about, what was the larger community of women photographers working, at this time in the 20s and 30s. And, I had always read in the history books that, well, this was a moment when you saw a lot of women photographers, kind of coming into the field, making a name for themselves. And I wanted to know more about that and to kind of think about, well, is it time for a large group exhibition that focuses on their work? And of course, what I found is that, a lot of women photographers, their biographies, their work, that's very underrepresented in the history of photography, even in exhibitions. And I was starting to think really focused, on this in around 2014. So this is a project I've been working on for a long time. And so I started, I really kind of developed a couple of questions that I wanted to focus on. And one was to think globally about women photographers during this period. So I really wanted to understand, well, if if, you know, there are quite a few women coming into the practice, particularly in Germany, you know, in the United States, but was that true around the world? And I had no idea. And then I was very interested in whether or not I could find different connections or networks between women photographers. You know, were they supporting each other? Were there any sort of educational, female-led educational or social or professional networks that were at play during this period? And I was very much inspired by a couple of different books. And I just have the covers here on the screen, The New Woman International and Modern Girl Around the World. And these two books are focused on this idea of the new woman. And I think that was such an important symbol of modernity. And I was wondering, well, within this moment where a lot of women are pushing for greater rights, you know, it seemed like, well, there was a connection to the rise of more women photographers during this period. And so I was asking again, like, okay, well, so who were some of the new women photographers in places like Lebanon or, you know, Japan, China, the Soviet Union, and then to think about, you know, how did those different cultural contexts, geographical contexts really affect what type of photography they practiced? You know, were they becoming professional photographers? And how really that would help expand, I think, and complicate our understanding of modern photography. So I want to take you through quickly through the exhibition as it was installed in the National Gallery. And so here we're looking at the entrance to the exhibition, and we see the Japanese photographer Tsuneko Sugimoto. So the new woman behind the camera featured more than 120 international photographers. And it you know, highlighted a group of diverse women who really did make significant advances in modern photography from the 1920s through the 1950s. The photographs on view reflected not only their personal experiences, but also the social and political transformations, you know, of the first half of the 20th century. Of course, this includes 2 world wars, a global economic depression, and the rise of fascism and communism. And so, you know, the pioneering efforts of these women, you know, to gain creative agency, to gain self-representation, were part of this broader struggle, right, that was kind of under that new woman umbrella to achieve greater gender equity. And again, you know, part of the reason to bring the focus on women photographers was to help push the history in a different direction, to also create a more inclusive history. You know, and just a little bit more about the concept that really is the foundation for the exhibition. You know, photography in the 1920s both visualized but also popularized key aspects of modernity, and of course, one was the new woman. You know, she was visualized as independent, you know, confident. She often had a short haircut, fashionable clothes, but she was a symbol that embodied, you know, a real range of identities that we do see emerge globally. And so that was also why I was interested to look globally for the women photographers, because you do see this symbol of greater, you know, female emancipation and a desire for greater rights really popping up all around the world. And you know, the new woman was more than a marketable image, and you know that one could see splashed across, you know, the pages of magazines and of course on the silver screen. She was quite a controversial symbol, but also I think an inspirational model. And this is all evolving alongside the, you know, new developments in photography, you know, during the 1920s. And so for me, it was that symbol of the new woman that was being widely circulated as an image, often through photographic means, that became, I think, a very compelling lens through which to look at women photographers and how they, you know, how they were coming into the field in greater numbers after World War I. So the exhibition opens with a compelling group of self-portraits and portraits of photographers at work. Of course, it was through portraits that women could establish themselves as artists, as photographers, as professionals. posing with their cameras, and I had a whole wall of women holding their cameras. They're really asserting their skill, their place in the rapidly expanding field. And two, in this room was very much an introduction to some of the new women photographers. And it also allowed me to reveal some of the depth of and diversity of the women themselves and the type of photography that they practiced. And here we're looking at Alma Lavinson, and this is her, really captivating self-portrait, which it was originally titled Photographer at Work. And this really became a signature image for the exhibition. Of course, rather than showing her face, she's showing us the act of taking a photograph and that how vital that was to her identity. And to make this photograph, she stood in front of a mirror, and there are very faint reflections of her visible on the highly polished surface of the camera lens. And here is on the right is a portrait, a self-portrait by Florence Henri. And here another reflection technique used by the artist that's very, very constructed and experimental. So raised in Bombay, which is now Mumbai, Homayi Veeravala was one of India's first female photojournalists. She began her career collaborating with her husband on assignments for the Bombay Chronicle and the Illustrated Weekly of India. And, at the beginning, some of her work was published under his name. Veeravala photographed everyday life in newsworthy events, such as this Hindu festival that celebrates the birthday of Ganesh, and that's the god of prosperity and wisdom. And here, seen carefully scaling a steep mountainside to get the perfect shot, is Nu Weiyu, and she was one of several women photographers who worked in the service of the People's Republic of China. And she photographed throughout China and Tibet, taking pictures of large-scale government projects and really revealing, the region's diverse population and spectacular geography. And here, learning from her uncle and apprenticing with Buenos Aires in 1932. And this was just 4 years after her family had emigrated from Germany to Argentina. She was very much intrigued by the dramatic lighting effects that were used in stage productions. And she produced, highly imaginative work. I think you can see that in this self-portrait. It's a topsy-turvy image of the photographer with her sister in her studio. So, through their self-portraits, women are exploring their personal identities as well. And some, like Claude Cahun, who's on the left, presented non-binary models of gender identity. Others, like Van de Boltz, was experimenting with different techniques like photo montage to express their creativity. And then filling out this opening room were a number of behind the scenes views that really offered the audience, I think, images and insight into the working lives of women photographers. And here we're looking at the fashion photographer Toni Frizzell. She's crouching in the center, of course, with the camera. And Frizzell really helped to revitalize fashion photography during the 1930s and the 1940s. This portrait was taken by her protege, Frances McLaughlin Gill. And again, affords us this behind the scenes look into the artifice of fashion photography. But what I also like about this photograph of it is it gives us a gender reversal roles, right? Toni is at work and her husband's watching their daughter in the foreground. So in the opening gallery, I chose to pick a kind of deep orange color, and you can see that here as an accent color, and I really brought that then through the exhibition. And I definitely had individual photographs hanging on the wall, but I also brought in a number of books and magazines because those were really, really crucial and important to the practice of photography during this period. So the next section focuses on the studio, and I developed the exhibition based on thematic sections. It was very much focused on the different kinds of photography women were practicing during the modern period. So the next section after the introduction is about the studio. And of course, work by commercial studio photographers has often been overlooked in the sort of art history of photography because it wasn't deemed artistic enough. But it really was studios that were an important entry point into the field for a number of women, allowed them to forge professional careers, earn their own income, to be more independent. And of course, women were always central to the production of photography and the production of studio photography from the medium's earliest days. Often anonymous. We do know that women were doing most of the hand coloring, they were mounting prints, they were retouching negatives, and they often served as studio receptionists. But what we do see by the 1920s is that more and more women are starting to open their own studios, they're running their own businesses, and they're claiming then their name behind the camera. So what I found in my research is that female-led studios were very active in cities such as London and Vienna during the 1920s and the 1930s. And here you have very lush, glamorous photographs that were made through, careful posing, skillful lighting, and deft retouching. In London, one example is Yvonne Cumbers, who opened her own studio, and she renamed herself Madame Yvonne. She made really fantastic work, very unconventional, imaginative. She was using color, which was very, very unusual. And she was using a newly invented process called the Vivex process. And here we're looking at just one example from a series that she titled The Goddesses. And here, Madame Yvonne then cast her sitters as mythological figures. Dorothy Wilding was a extremely successful studio photographer in London, and her clientele was very elite celebrities and members of the royal family, including Queen Elizabeth II. She was very fond of Art Deco design, which I think you can see in her studio on the left. And she really applied that aesthetic then to her portraits. And we're looking at one portrait of the acclaimed stage and screen performer, Diana Wynyard. So one of the many female studio photographers who was working in Vienna in Austria was the prolific Trudy Fleischmann. And she opened her own business in 1920. And really quickly earned a reputation for producing really exceptional portraits that had a lot of psychological intensity. So I followed the portrait by Wilding, by two from Trudy Fleischmann. So here's the details. She used extreme close-up views, soft focus, as we can see in this portrait of the avant-garde composer Alban Berg. And, compared to the other fine arts, photography was much more accessible to women during this period. It was more financially viable. One could actually earn an income and be independent through photography. One often learned through photography through apprenticeships with other photographers. And, some were teaching themselves, and you could find a lot of materials about how to learn to be a photographer. Well, it's also interesting, though, is that during this period, there were the existence of technical schools that focused on teaching photography. And those were open to women much earlier than the fine arts schools were open to women. And this really did lead to an increased number of professional women photographers in those cities that had those schools. So Trudy Fleischmann went to the school that was in Vienna. She trained other students that went to that school. She, worked with figures like Steffi Brondel. So here was a way for me to try to start making those connections. And a lot of those connections between women photographers was through the studio, through apprenticeships. So in a page spread from a 1940 issue of the Photo Times, we see Eiko Yamazawa gazing into her viewfinder with her assistant adjusting a light. So Yamazawa, by this time, was an experienced professional photographer. She had established her own studio in 1931 in Osaka, Japan. And, notwithstanding her expertise, the article in the magazine, which was called A Woman Who Lives for the Camera, really associates Yamazawa with, the very gendered notion that women, somehow naturally possess a talent for portraying children and other domestic subjects. Of course, we see Yamazawa photographing a toddler in the magazine, but she, of course, photographed a wide variety of different people. She actually started her portrait business by photographing local businessmen. And what I showed in the exhibition were these really amazing vintage prints of the actress Sue Yamamoto that Yamazawa photographed, and this is during the war period. And these photographs just were recently rediscovered, and I was very, very excited to be able to put them into the exhibition. But here, they're very, very subtle. It was a small series of photographs, and I think you can see how Yamazawa is, really showing Yamamoto's skill as a performer through these very subtle shifts in expression and gesture. So, of course, in many countries around the world, in the Middle East and Asia, social customs dictated that women and children could not be photographed by men who were not, from their own families. And this really created a need then for women photographers. And you see a growth of women photographers in places like Palestine and Iraq and India and Turkey and Korea. Yet, most of the names of these women are unknown. You'll find advertisements that for studios that say, that they have women photographers. So it's, women can come and children can come to get their photographs, but you don't know who these women were. But one exception is Karima Aboud. She established the first female-run photography studio in Palestine. And, she often photographed her sitters at their homes. And so she would go out to them, she would bring her equipment, she would bring her backdrop. And we know about her in part because she stamped her work with her name. African-American women operated studios in Chicago, New Orleans, New York, and elsewhere in the United States. But really the extent of their roles and their contributions, has not been fully established. One photographer I was able to bring into the exhibition was Floristine Perot Collins, and she ran a successful studio from 1920 to 1949 in New Orleans. She was a skilled practitioner, a really astute businesswoman, and she used portraits like this to advertise, her photography. And, I think this is just an amazing portrait. She's wearing a bejeweled clip in her hair. She has bobbed hair, pearls, a fashionable dress. So she's really presenting herself here as a, modern new woman. So in the next section, we journey outside the studio into the city. And, with the availability of smaller cameras, coupled with the increasing freedom to move about the public sphere on their own, more and more women were out on the streets making street photography. And, we have figures like Bernice Abbott, as well as Lisette Model, who are building their careers in places such as Paris. But there were also women who were photographing in Mexico City. So Lola Alvarez Bravo really offers, I think, incisive commentary on the political and social movements that reshaped Mexico during the post-revolutionary period. But this was a moment when women were still regulated to domestic life, to the private sphere. And so using her affinity for visual metaphor, she photographs this young woman looking out, from the confines of her apartment, of her windowsill, and she's, partially obscured by this wonderful, delicate cage of shadows. And in Bombay, India, figures like Vera Ravala were photographing spontaneous encounters on the street, really providing, I think, a more nuanced picture of modernization. So as an art student, Vera Ravala, she taught herself photography alongside her husband. And, she was really bringing, I think, this sharp eye to daily life in the city's diverse communities, as well as key locations, such as the Victoria Terminus. And so the train station, which we see in the background, was an architectural hybrid testifying to the imposition of European taste on Indian traditions. And it's usually shown in very spectacular, grand scale. But I think, in this photograph, we see how Vieiravala is diminishing its dominance. She positions her camera low to the ground. She's glimpsing the station through all these different layers, right? Through the wheels of carriage that then frame a man who's pushing a cart in the middle ground. And we see small scale pedestrians, a tourist bus off into the distance. And so, she's training herself. She's thinking about modern compositional devices, creating, I think, a very dynamic work that's a study in perspective, that's a study in different modes of transportation, but two, offering us, offering just really a fresh interpretation of the city's historical symbols. And I had on one of the walls a section devoted to work that was made in Brazil. So an established photojournalist in the United States, Genevieve Naylor, traveled to Brazil in 1940. She was on assignment for the Office of Inter-American Affairs, and she was based in Rio de Janeiro, and she spent about 3 years in Brazil and took over 1,300 photographs that really explored, the country's architecture, culture, diverse population. So in this work, Naylor captures, commuters dangerously clinging onto a densely packed streetcar. And, the trolley was a favored means of transportation, and especially for Brazil's working class, and, came to really represent the country's increasingly urban society. And of course, while women like Naylor traveled abroad on assignment, many others were leaving home involuntarily to avoid persecution, particularly with the rise of the Nazi Party. Hildegard Rosenthal fled Europe in 1937 with her fiancé Walter, who was Jewish, and the two of them settled in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Now, Hildegard made around 3,000 images that really bear witness to that city's evolution into an industrial and financial center. I really liked this picture. It's of a street corner. It gives us a sense of the city's liveliness. You have three smartly dressed businessmen are socializing. There's a crowd that's congregating around a fruit vendor's cart. And at the center, we have this young woman who's kind of looking directly out at us, the viewers, she's looking directly at the photographer. And she happens to be Rosenthal's assistant, which I think is a great little tidbit of information. So in the following section titled Avant-Garde Experimentations, I really wanted to display an amazing range of innovative and creative work as women were looking at, all these different possibilities with a camera. Really that sense of modern photography, that we think of, often called the new vision, right? So these different new vision techniques, such as extreme close-ups, using long exposure times to capture movements, dizzying camera angles and unconventional cropping, were all being used during this period, right, to make surprising and compelling pictures that called normal viewing habits into question. Several of the photographers used the compositional lighting skills, I think, to create intriguing pictures that focused on the structure of everyday objects, many of which were found in the home. Working in a commercial studio in Sydney, Australia, Olive Cotton became intrigued by a new set of cups and saucers that she purchased for the studio. She kind of noticed that their graceful hands, they resembled arms akimbo, and she decided then to stage and light the teacups as dancers. And so here we have the teacup ballet. And on the right, layering locks of hair, scissors, a comb, and a razor blade onto a sheet of photographic paper, Bernice Calco exposed that composition to light and produced a photogram that really evokes a visit to the hair salon. And to me, I just thought this was a great image because it implicitly honors, I think, that symbolic action of liberation carried out by many women who cut their hair short, right, to kind of be a new woman. And on the left, while studying fashion design in Tokyo in 1950, Toshiko Okonoe started making these elaborate collages, and she would cut images from American fashion and lifestyle magazines to create, I think, quite unsettling photo montages like the one on the left that's called Full of Life. And she continued to do this work for about 7 years and then abruptly stopped once she got married. So the exhibition argues that the artistic flourishing of photography during the 1920s into the 1950s was advanced by a number of now canonical figures such as Imogen Cunningham, but also by less familiar photographers such as Louise Davis, who taught dance and physical education at Hampton Institute, which is now Hampton College, a historically Black university in Virginia. Davis installed a home darkroom. She produced, I think, these really interesting and enigmatic photograms that captured ephemeral materials such as ice, crystals, and smoke. And Anna Barner's work was literally rediscovered under a bed in the New York City apartment of the celebrated photographer Andre Kertész. So the two Hungarian-born photographers first met in Paris, where this playful print of an onlooker was made. And the exhibition featured a video, and we brought, I wanted to bring some of the voices of these photographers into the exhibition. Now, of course, most of these photographers were no longer living, and so we were looking at different excerpts from older, documentaries. But I was able to visit Tsuneko Sasimoto, who just recently passed away. But I was able on 3 different trips between 2017 and 2019, I was able to go visit her in Japan. And on the last visit, we interviewed her. So this video brings in some of that footage along with the other previously recorded footage. And that video is still up on the YouTube site if you're interested. So the next section I called Modern Bodies, and it really examined how these new concepts regarding health and sexuality and changing attitudes about movement and dress really indicated the body, right, as a central concern for modernity. Of course, this had striking implications for both women and men. And what I was interested in is that I was also finding, a number of women photographers who were producing, these incisive visions of modern bodies. These include pioneering photographs of the nude. Here on the left, we see Yvonne Chevalier's very up-close rendering of a nude body. She's abstracting it through her close-up view. She's suggesting the gender. And then there are these, other photographs of dance and gymnastic movements, like the one on the right by Zlata Grishibina, as we see a female athlete, right, jumping doing a pike jump. And I had a number of photographs of just really stunning pictures of dancers in motion, and these women photographers were capturing this motion using different kinds of light and shadows to create very, very exciting photographs. What I found too is that a number of women pursued, professional careers. They were traveling during this period, many for the first time. And what I found is that a lot of women photographers from the United States, from Europe, were documenting their travels and their experiences abroad in places such as Africa, Asia, South America. What we have too is a number of women photographers who were engaged with quite formal ethnographic projects that were supported by their home countries. And the works on view in the section that I called ethnographic approaches really shed light on that quite complex and usually unequal relationship between photographer and subject. I think, several women understood their privileged position behind the camera. They were producing quite sensitive portraits that were celebrating cultural difference. What you find too is that gender often afforded women certain opportunities. They had access to more private quarters that were off limits to their male counterparts. And we see that here in the work of Ray Supol, who was working in Tunisia. But of course, all of this doesn't, exempt any individual photographer from producing views that reinforced hierarchical concepts of race and ethnocentrism. Eslanda Good Robeson was an anthropologist and civil rights activist. She was married to the actor Paul Robeson. She studied at the London School of Economics and took 3 fieldwork trips to Africa. These were in the later 30s, and in her 1945 book that she titled African Journey, she illustrated it with a number of these photographs that she took on her fieldwork trips. And I think, as you can see, a number of this ethnographic work was published in photo books. And so in the gallery space, I had quite a large vitrine with a number of these books. And here we're looking at just another example by the Swedish photographer Anna Rivkin. And she photographed the Sami peoples of Lapland, producing, I think, a really engaged photographic record of the culture. So then I turned to fashion photography and advertising photography. So, there was a growing fashion industry at this time, and it was generating, I think, a really unprecedented demand for photographs. And these photographs were put into these lavishly illustrated journals. And all of this was presenting and providing, more employment opportunities for women. It allowed for women to really emerge as key players in the fashion industry. Fashion photography, of course, defined the new woman. It also cultivated a taste of recently empowered female consumers. This was, of course, an environment that was driven by commercial pressures. But I think that women photographers also found it as a place that encouraged experimentation as well as individual expression. So just a few of the women fashion photographers that I had in the show. Eva opened her first studio in Berlin in 1925. She really quickly became a sought-after commercial and fashion photographer. And, her distinctive work, like this jewelry study on the left, really evokes this quite surreal, but also very luxurious atmosphere. The Harper's art director turned photographer, Lillian Bassman, produced soft-edged, starkly toned, quite innovative prints, like this one on the right. And here we see a model wearing a very diaphanous, wide-brimmed hat. And Bassman was already, in the 50s, manipulating her negatives, creating these stark contrasts. And, I think her work is striking because it's departing from that conventional, straightforward look of a lot of fashion photography. Now, throughout her career, Louise Dahl-Wolf preferred to work on location. She was a staff photographer at Harper's Bazaar from 1936 to 1958, where she had 86 covers, some 600 color photographs, and really countless black and white photographs published right in the pages of Harper's Bazaar. Here we're seeing her shooting in the bright Arizona sun. She's outside the Rose Pawson House in Phoenix, and she's imaging a model, which casting these really intriguing angular shadows and constructing the scene that really is complementing the very modern architecture, right, of the Frank Lloyd House. That is the setting for the work. I ended the exhibition with 2 rooms that were focusing on documentary and photojournalism. So, of course, during this period, during a time of worldwide economic instability and political extremes, women photographers were producing arresting images of the human condition, whether they were hired by government agencies or they were working independently. Women really contributed to the visual record of the Depression and the events leading up to World War II. And, we're very much helping to define what we now think of as social documentary photography. So documentary photographs served, of course, various goals spanning the social and political spectrum. Someone like Dorothea Lange is best known for her pictures that she made for the Farm Security Administration, documenting the migration and struggles of agricultural workers, like this family from Oklahoma that we see on the left. And of course, this was a way for the U.S. government to promote and get word out about different assistance programs. Now, what I did in the exhibition is I brought Lang's work into conversation with a photographer from the Soviet Union by the name of Elizaveta Ignatovich. Now, Ignatovich was a member of the very radical avant-garde October group, but like a lot of Soviet artists, to maintain her career, to really protect her safety, she had to comply with Joseph Stalin's demand for an idealized social realist style. So she, radically changed her aesthetics and her approach to photography. And here we see this, more realist style on the right. This photograph, of course, supports the Communist Party's economic and social policies. What I find so striking about it is that we literally have the curtains drawn open to see this kind of perfect, happy family. And, this kind of satisfying life is achievable through collective farming. And that was really the message then of that photograph. And for me, I wanted to put these two photographs in dialogue together as a way to really set the tone for the rest of the room, the rest of the gallery. That was pushing audiences to really think about how photographs, tell history, how they, what kind of, how were they used, who was using them, and what were their claims, right, to truth. Lang, after working for the Resettlement Administration, the Farm Security Administration, she was hired again by the government, this time by the War Relocation Authority, and this was in 1942. And she was hired to document some of the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry that the U.S. forced to leave their homes and relocate into camps after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. So I have two works from that project that Lang did, next to one by Hansel Meath, and you're kind of seeing that from the center to the right, as a way to show how that the very dark American response, right, to Japan's imperialist aggression that brought the United States definitely into World War II. And Lang was, photographing the forced displacement of Japanese Americans, not just the sort of act of rounding up these different members of the community, many of whom were citizens of the United States, but she wanted to look, broader at how this was really destroying communities. So one of the images I brought in this work is in the gallery's permanent collection is titled, what we talk about it as I'm an American, and the owner of the grocery store, Mr. Matsuda, placed this large sign that says I'm an American in the shop's window on December 8th, right? So the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But of course, as we can see by some of the other signs and text that's in this photograph, that his store was closed, it was sold, and Mr. Matsuda was relocated. Also in this space, I bring into the discussion the work of Margaret Burke White. Of course, she was a well-known path-breaking photographer. She was quite celebrated for her daring pictures of skyscrapers and heavy industry. She was selected by the publisher Henry Luce to serve as the first staff photographer at Fortune magazine in 1929. Of course, she did a lot of traveling the world and really became famous for her work for Life magazine. And this image here, this photograph here, was used as the cover of the first issue of Life magazine when it was relaunched by Luce in 1936. So what's really, I think, very important during this period, of course, is the rise of the picture press. It really established photojournalism as a dominant form of visual expression. Rotogravure technologies and the transmission of pictures by wire really spurred the reproduction of all kinds of photographic images. These were widely circulated in newspapers and magazines, Really so much so that by 1939, the historian and photographer Lucia Moholy noted that life without photographs is no longer imaginable. She said they pass before our eyes and awaken our interest. They pass through the atmosphere unseen and unheard. They're in our lives as our lives are in them. So this brings me then to the very, very last gallery, and this is the room that I focused on reportage and war photojournalism. So here in the foreground, in a vitrine, we can see published work by Gerda Taro of the Spanish Civil War, alongside some of those images by Margaret Burke White that were published in Life magazine. Now, gender bias often led to women receiving the so-called soft assignments of photographing the home front, of working on stories that focused on women and children. But what I wanted to show is the complexity and also danger of such assignments. Now, the Jewish photographer Emmy Andries, she worked with false papers and a concealed camera in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam, taking pictures of the last winter of the occupation, which was known as the Hunger Winter, where thousands died because of a famine that was caused by the German blockade of the city. And in 1937, the Hungarian-born Kati Horna moved to Spain to record the country's ongoing civil war. So her works, include both these very stark documents of soldiers in trenches, as well as bombed out cities. But she also made more surreal photo montages, like this one called Stairway to the Cathedral. So Horna created this image by superimposing two negatives, one of a woman's face and a second of a brick stairwell. And, by positioning the woman's right eye behind a barred window, I think that she's really alluding to the oppression, right, that was, endured by the civilian population, particularly by women. The American photographer Therese Bonney was in Finland in 1939. She was there to document preparations for the Olympics, but then the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and so she inadvertently became the first foreign correspondent to cover that invasion. She continued her coverage of war in Finland. She went on to France and Great Britain, focusing on troops and prisoners of war, as well as the suffering of civilians and refugees. So her pictures made not only front page news, but were also circulated in books and exhibitions. Now, Bonney's activist-minded reportage during World War II inspired this comic strip from 1944. And I think, while photography is kind of an unlikely superpower for any comic book hero of any gender, what we see here is photo fighter Bonnie, and she's depicted on one of her truth raids across Europe. And she's revealing the truth right through her photography, through her camera. And the story really highlights her courage and her single-minded determination, right, to record the war and get that information out. But what I found, of course, is that only a handful of women really served on the front as war photographers. Here, trained as a nurse, a driver, and a mechanic, Galina Senko became a war correspondent on the front lines in the Soviet Union. And in countries such as India, Japan, and China, photojournalism was just really emerging as a viable profession for women. Of course, Vieira was working and was quite successful. In 1942, she joined the British Information Services, and then later worked as a stringer for many international agencies, including Black Star and Time Life. She covered the assassination of Gandhi and his burial. After working for Japan's imperialist government for 8 months in 1940, Tsuneko Sasimoto resumed her photographic career after the war. She worked as a freelance photojournalist, and in 1950, she became a charter member of the Japan Professional Photographer Society, really one of the few women who became a charter member. And we're looking at on the right of her very moving photograph of the Hiroshima Memorial during a lantern ceremony. And Niue, you had a very long career working for major news agencies, for the People's Republic of China. And I think in this very, very moving photograph, she's capturing three women very much lost in their own thoughts, right, as they're doing their work. So, thinking a little bit about my curatorial practice for this project, and this is a very special project. It was a project that took many years. It involved a lot of research. It involved a lot of travel, and now after the pandemic, I just feel so privileged to have had that opportunity to do so much traveling. And I was traveling, from 2014 to 2019 to find the work. I mean, that was also a major challenge. The exhibition involved loans from private collections, from public institutions, including museums and archives, lots of in-house collaboration with a number of different departments to make such a big exhibition, actually happen. And there was also a lot of work involved because I produced a catalog as well. And, there were just a number of, interesting challenges that were involved in the project. Exhibitions are, of course, sites of exchange. They're sites of creativity, but they're short-lived. They're by nature always incomplete. They're selective. There were so many women photographers that I wanted to bring into the exhibition, but I just couldn't. Right? There's always space limitations. There are financial limitations. And there are attention limitations. You can't have a show that just goes on and on and on. It's too hard to take in. There were a lot of challenges that came up just through the research. And it was partly why I was very interested in the topic, because there was so much more to learn about these women photographers. And, a lot of the information, a lot of their biographies it's been lost. Their work has been destroyed. A lot of their negatives were never processed. A number of their careers were cut short by the expectation that they assume all child rearing and domestic responsibilities. Other career paths were truncated, very much like their male colleagues, by political exile, wartime atrocity, post-war censors. And still, I think others have been, kind of pushed out of the history or not given enough attention because of the kind of photography that they practice, whether it was commercial advertising photography or studio portraiture or even fashion work. And, I think too, just the, continuing biases that, one finds in traditional histories that have really downplayed women's contributions, however substantial, right, to the visual culture of the time period. And I wanted to bring in just a few images as a comparison, and this might spark a few questions of a different exhibition, and I think what I really love about my job is that I can work on so many different kinds of projects. And an earlier project called The Memory of Time, this was on display at the National Gallery in 2015, and it was one of 3 exhibitions that was organized by the Department of Photographs to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the founding of the department. And the exhibition honored the donors who established the first endowed fund for photography. And that was established in 2007, which was just, incredibly important for the gallery to acquire photographs and to develop the collection. And, we decided to highlight the contemporary photographs that we had just recently purchased, through this endowed fund. So the curatorial goals were different than, the curatorial goals that I had for the New Woman. We were focusing on contemporary work. We were interested in, compelling works that reflected and engaged really all that the medium has to offer. And we also created a thematic exhibition to do this. And we were interested in how, contemporary photographers, contemporary artists who used photography were interested in, ideas in relationship to time, to memory and history. And what we brought together was a show that had work by 26 different artists. And when after the fact, and we were kind of doing some analysis, we found that it was this perfect split. It was like 13 male artists, 13 female artists, and they represented 10 different nationalities. And so here there was no kind of set agenda for who was the photographer, like the new woman. I really wanted to focus on women photographers. But we just sort of had this really quite interesting equity that came out of just our own interest in contemporary work. And of course, here we were bringing in some of the work by Sugimoto, and I know you're an artist of interest during this year. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Just really fascinating and so thorough. I can't imagine how. I have a quick question before we get to one of the questions that came through. How long was the New Woman exhibition up at the National Gallery of Art?
So the exhibition was up for about 3 months, and it always depends on how long the tour is. And so when we realized that it was just going to be the National Gallery and the Met, we had planned on the show being up longer in both places. Of course, this was before the pandemic, right? And we had to cancel and postpone not cancel, I shouldn't say cancel. We had to postpone, we almost canceled, but we had to postpone the exhibition several times. And by that point, we were just lucky to kind of fit it into a schedule. So rather than, having it on view for 4 months, or even a little bit more at both places, it ended up only being on view for about 3 months. Of course, with photography, you always have to, be conscious of and limit the amount of light exposure.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much work. You said 2014, so that's seven years of work for that short amount of time. I'm glad you got a catalog out of it to be able to, commemorate it and things. Well, congratulations on the exhibition. It looks fantastic. We did have one question come through, and I want to remind anybody watching, if you have any questions, you can submit them in the chat or with the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Jillian McMaster, who's actually on staff here at the Delaplaine, and she's a photographer as well. She asked, could you talk about the curatorial choice to integrate photo books in a photo exhibition and how it's approached as an art object?
Well, I think that it was a very easy choice to make. I mean, and I also felt like it was a very important choice to make, because this was how a lot of the work was being seen at the time, that a lot of photography circulated in books and was made for publications, whether it was for magazines or books. And this is really how people saw it at the time. Of course, there were exhibitions, and, even with that really, really wonderful photograph by Margaret Burke White of the Fort Peck Dam, and that negative, an image was made from that negative and was used for the cover of the first, issue of Life magazine in 1936. But she did make a very lovely large exhibition print, and so that was the print that we were able to purchase and bring into the collection. So you have photographers who are making different prints for different reasons, some for exhibitions, of course, some really the impetus of that work was to be published. And so I really wanted to get that type of work into the show so people could see really how the work was seen at the time, and really what, a lot of this work was assignments for different magazines. Of course, it's always hard to show books in exhibitions because you can only open it up to one page. And I had, thought a lot about, there are different ways one can show like the fullness of a book. And I think you may have come across this in different exhibitions. Sometimes there might be an iPad or a video that will show, someone turning the pages, or show you the images of the rest of the book. And I very much had planned to do that for a couple of the works in the exhibition, but it really was one of the things that, got cut because of the pandemic. And, really, the exhibition, it was supposed to open at the gallery first, but because of all of these postponements, it ended up opening first at the Met. And this was in the summer of 2021. We were just constantly, we were closed for such a long time. We didn't really have the time or the ability to do some of those extra steps that, show more of that book, unfortunately. But.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, as you're working on curating an exhibition that deals with a specific time period, do you feel, and you're also working with contemporary work, the other exhibition, what was it? The Memory of Time, is contemporary photography. I'm curious about, as a curator, I would imagine your work on the work of the past is informing your understanding of the work, the contemporary work that you're dealing with. And I don't know if you had anything to say about just sort of the revelatory things that come about from that, or the historical understanding, or.
Yeah, I think really just understanding, some of the history of photography or the history of art always helps to bring, another layer, right, of understanding and interpretation when you're seeing, new work or contemporary work. And so, I think what was interesting with the Memory of Time is we were looking at work by photographers and artists who were really kind of thinking about, issues of time and memory, but those issues and ideas are so intertwined, right, with the practice of photography. So, a number of photographers were really thinking about previous practitioners or the history of photography. And so, that, my research and knowledge, really then helps me to understand better, right, contemporary practices. I can definitely say that. And, I think that came into play with a number of the, contemporary photographers that we brought into the collection. What's interesting is on some levels, it's kind of a different kind of research too, though, when you get to work with contemporary artists. You get to talk to them, of course. You can do studio visits, and, it was a different research experience than when you're dealing with a lot of historical work where you're just trying to find it. I spent a lot of time, when I was doing the research for The New Woman, was just to find who these women photographers were, and to try to find some of their work, right? That's one of the challenges of an exhibition is, how do you show work by, artists and photographers where, there's not a lot of work out there, but you want to show their presence. You want to show how they were really making an impact. And, I think I was fortunate enough to find enough work that I could bring in, but there were definitely photographers that I had wanted to add, but I couldn't into the show. But that's definitely why it's really great to have a catalog, because you can talk more about these, photographers. And, some there are still negatives, which is really great. So there's a way to show some of that work, in printed catalogs as well. So
It's great. the exhibition looks so thoughtful in the way that you piece together the different rooms and things. It was just really fascinating. Um, I'm wondering if you're working on anything right now that you can give us a hint towards. Are there any exhibitions that you're working towards or in the middle of research on?
Well, I think right now I'm looking back into the collection and I'm thinking about what can I do, really that's grounded again in the collection and that can bring out a number of works that we haven't seen or put on view before. And I think right now I'm focused on work that's being produced in the 70s. So
Gotcha. Is your look into the collection how the idea for the New Woman exhibition sort of had its inception?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really was, looking at Ilse Bing and, really thinking about, well, she was the, one woman photographer that we had, in-depth holdings of, we almost had 100 photographs by her. And really thinking that we needed to spend more time on her work and to highlight her work. And then that just kind of opened up more questioning, from me. And then I decided to make it a bigger show.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I'm excited to share this with other folks as we hone in and focus on photography here at the Delaplaine for November. We'll be pointing folks in the direction of the YouTube version of this. And it was really great having you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us for our Art at Noon series for October. And again, come check out our exhibitions on site and our upcoming programming and classes and all that good stuff. Go over to our YouTube channel and check out what we've got going on over there and point your friends in that direction. Even for this talk here in a couple weeks, we'll have it up. So thank you all and have a happy Friday.